Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. Part 1. The Girl. In the middle of the ocean, there was a girl who lived upon a rock. This was not an ocean like the one you have imagined, nor was the rock like the one you have imagined. The girl, however, might be as you imagined, assuming you imagined her as thoughtful, soft-spoken, and overly fond of collecting cups. Men often described the girl as having hair the color of wheat. Others called it the color of caramel, or occasionally the color of honey. The girl wondered why men so often used food to describe women's features. There was a hunger to such men that was best avoided. In her estimation, light brown was sufficiently descriptive, though the hue of her hair was not its most interesting trait. That would be her hair's unruliness. Each morning she heroically tamed it with brush and comb, then muzzled it with a ribbon and a tight braid. Yet some strands always found a way to escape and would wave free in the wind, eagerly greeting everyone she passed. The girl had been given the unfortunate name of Glorf upon her birth, but her wild hair earned her the name everyone knew her by, Tress. That moniker was, in Tress's estimation, her most interesting feature. Tress had been raised to possess a certain inalienable pragmatism, such as a common failing among those who live on dour lifeless islands from which they can never leave. When you are greeted each day by a black stone landscape, it influences your perspective on life. The island was shaped rather like an old man's crooked finger, emerging from the ocean to point toward the horizon. It was made entirely of barren black saltstone, and was large enough to support a fair-sized town and a duke's mansion. Though locals called the island the Rock, its name on the maps was Diggin's Point. No one remembered who Diggin was anymore, but he had obviously been a clever fellow, for he'd left the rock soon after naming it and never returned. In the evenings, Tress would often sit on her family's porch and sip salty tea from one of her favorite cups while looking out over the green ocean. Yes, I did say the ocean was green. Also, it was not wet. We're getting there. As the sun set, Tress would wonder about the people who visited the rock in their ships. Not that anyone in their right mind would deem the rock a tourist destination. The black saltstone was crumbly and got into everything. It also made most kinds of agriculture impossible, eventually tainting any soil brought from off the island. The only food the island grew came from compost vats. While the rock did have important wells that brought up water from a deep aquifer, something that visiting ships required, the equipment that worked the salt mines belched a constant stream of black smoke into the air. In summary, the atmosphere was dismal, the ground wretched, and the views depressing. Oh, and have I mentioned the deadly spores? Diggin's Point lay near the verdant lunagre. The term lunagre, you should know, refers to the places where the 12 moons hang in the sky around Tress's planet in oppressively low stationary orbits. Big enough to fill a full third of the sky, one of the 12 is always visible, no matter where you travel, dominating your view like a wart on your eyeball. The locals worship those 12 moons as gods, which we can all agree is far more ridiculous than whatever it is you worship. However, it's easy to see where the superstition began, bearing in mind the spores like colorful sand that the moons dropped upon the land. They'd pour down from the lunagres, and the verdant lunagre was visible some 50 or 60 miles from the island. That was as close as you ever wanted to get to a lunagre, a great shimmering fountain of colorful motes, vibrant and exceedingly dangerous. The spores filled the world's oceans, creating vast seas not of water, but of alien dust. Ships sailed that dust like ships sail water here, and you should not find that so unusual. How many other planets have you visited? Perhaps they all sail oceans of pollen, and your home is the freakish one. The spores were only dangerous if you got them wet, which was rather a problem, considering the number of wet things that leak from human bodies even when they're healthy. The least bit of water would cause the spores to sprout explosively, and the results ranged from uncomfortable to deadly. Breathe in a burst of verdant spores, for example, and your saliva would send vines growing out of your mouth, or in more interesting cases, into your sinuses and out around your eyes. The spores could be rendered inert by two things, salt or silver, hence the reason the locals of Diggin's Point didn't terribly mind the salty taste of their water or food. They'd teach their children this ever so important rule: salt and silver halt the killer. An acceptable little poem, if you're the sort of barbarian who enjoys slant rhymes. Regardless, with the spores, the smoke, and the salt, one can perhaps see why the king who the duke served needed a law requiring the population to remain on the rock. Oh, he gave reasons that involved important military phrases like essential personnel, strategic resupply, and friendly anchorage, but everyone knew the truth. The place was so inhospitable, even the smog found it depressing. Ships visited periodically for repairs, to drop off waste for the compost vats, and to take on new water. But each strictly obeyed the king's rules. No locals were to be taken from Diggin's Point, ever. And so, Tress would sit on her steps in the evenings, watching ships sail away as a column of spores dropped from the lunagre and the sun moved out from behind the moon and crept toward the horizon. She'd sip salty tea from a cup with horses painted on it, and she'd think, there's a beauty to this, actually. I like it here, and I believe I shall be fine to remain here all my life. Part 2. The Groundskeeper. Perhaps you were surprised to hear those last words. Tress wanted to stay on the rock. She liked it there. Where was her sense of adventure? Her yearning for new lands? Her wanderlust? Well, this isn't the part of the story where you ask questions, so kindly keep them to yourself. That said, you must understand that this is a tale about people who are both what they seem and not what they seem. simultaneously, a story of contradictions. In other words, it is a story about human beings. In this case, Tress wasn't your ordinary heroine in that she was in fact decidedly ordinary. Indeed, Tress considered herself categorically boring. She liked her tea lukewarm. She went to bed on time. She loved her parents, occasionally squabbled with her little brother, and didn't litter. She was fair at needlepoint and had a talent for baking, but had no other noteworthy skills. She didn't train at fencing in secret. She couldn't talk to animals. She had no hidden royalty or deities in her lineage, though her great-grandmother Glorf had reportedly once waved at the king. That had been from atop the rock while he was sailing past, many miles away, so Tress didn't think it counted. In short, Tress was a normal teenage girl. She knew this because the other girls often mentioned how they weren't like everyone else, and after a while Tress figured that the group everyone else must include only her. The other girls were obviously right, as they all knew how to be unique. They were so good at it, in fact, that they did it together. Tress was generally more thoughtful than most people, and she didn't like to impose by asking for what she wanted. She'd remain quiet when the other girls were laughing or telling jokes about her. After all, they were having so much fun. It would be impolite to spoil that, and presumptuous of her to request that they stop. Sometimes the more boisterous youths talked of seeking adventure in foreign oceans. Tress found that notion frightening. How could she leave her parents and brother? Besides, she had her cup collection. Tress cherished her cups. She had fine porcelain cups with painted glaze, clay cups that felt rough beneath her fingers, and wooden cups that were rugged and well used. Several of the sailors who frequently docked at Diggins Point knew of her fondness, and they sometimes brought her cups from all across the 12 oceans, distant lands where the spores were reportedly crimson, azure, or even golden. She'd give the sailors pies in exchange for their gifts, the ingredients purchased with the pittance she earned scrubbing windows. The cups they brought her were often battered and worn, but Tress didn't mind. A cup with a chip or ding in it had a story. She loved them all because they brought the world to her. Whenever she sipped from one of the cups, she imagined she could taste far-off foods and drinks, and perhaps understand a little of the people who had crafted them. Each time Tress acquired a new cup, she brought it to Charlie, to show it off. Charlie claimed to be the groundskeeper at the Duke's mansion at the top of the rock, but Tress knew he was actually the Duke's son. Charlie's hands were soft like a child's rather than calloused, and he was better fed than anyone else in town. His hair was always cut neatly, and though he took his signet ring off when he saw her, it left a slightly lighter patch of skin that made it clear he usually wore it on the finger that marked a member of the nobility. Besides, Tress wasn't certain what grounds Charlie thought needed keeping. The mansion was, after all, on the rock. There had been a tree on the property once, but it had done the sensible thing and died a few years earlier. There were some potted plants though, which let him pretend. Gray motes swirled in the wind by her feet as she climbed the path up to the mansion. Gray spores were dead. The very air around the rock was salty enough to kill spores, but she still held her breath as she hurried past. She turned left at the fork. The right path went to the mines, then wove up the switchbacks to the overhang. Here the mansion squatted like a corpulent frog atop its lily. Tress wasn't certain why the Duke liked it up here. It was closer to the smog, so maybe he liked the similarly tempered company. Climbing all this way was difficult, but judging by how the Duke's family fit their clothing, perhaps they figured they could use the exercise. 5 soldiers watched the grounds, though only Snagu and Lead were on duty now, and they did their job well. After all, it had been a horribly long time since anyone in the Duke's family had died from the myriad of dangers a nobleman faced while living on the rock. She brought the soldiers pies, naturally. As they ate, she considered showing the 2 men her new cup. It was made completely of tin, stamped with letters in a language that ran top to bottom instead of left to right. But no, she didn't want to bother them. They let her pass, although it wasn't her day to wash the mansion's windows. She found Charlie around back, practicing with his fencing sword. When he saw her, he put it down and hurriedly took off his signet ring. Tress, he said, I thought you wouldn't be by today. Having just turned 17, Charlie was 2 months older than she was. He had an abundance of smiles, and she had identified each one. For instance, the wide-toothed one he gave her now said he was genuinely happy to have an excuse to be done with fencing practice. He wasn't as fond of it as his father thought he should be. Swordplay, Charlie, she asked, is that a groundskeeper's task? He picked up the thin dueling sword. But it is for gardening. He took a half-hearted swipe at one of the potted plants on the patio. The plant wasn't quite dead yet, but the leaf Charlie split certainly wasn't going to improve its chances. Gardening, Tress said, with a sword. It's how they do things on the King's Island, Charlie said. He swiped again. There is always war there, you know, so if you consider it, it's natural the groundskeepers would learn to trim plants with a sword. Don't want to get ambushed when you're unarmed. He wasn't a good liar, but that was part of what Tress liked about him. Charlie was genuine. He even lied in an authentic way, and seeing how bad he was at telling them, the lies couldn't be held against him. They were so obvious, they were better than many a person's truths. He swiped his sword in the vague direction of the plant once more, then looked at her and cocked an eyebrow. She shook her head. So he gave her his "you've caught me but I can't admit it" grin and rammed the sword into the dirt of the pot, then plopped down on the low garden wall. The sons of dukes were not supposed to plop. One might therefore consider Charlie to have been a young man of extraordinary talents. Tress settled in next to him, basket in her lap. What did you bring me? He said. She took out a small meat pie. Pigeon, she said, and carrots, with a thyme-seasoned gravy. A noble combination, he said. I think the Duke's son, if he were here, would disagree. The Duke's son is only allowed to eat dishes with names that have weird foreign accents over their letters, Charlie said. And he's never allowed to stop sword practice to eat. So it is fortunate that I am not him. Charlie took a bite. She watched for the smile. And there it was, the smile of delight. She had spent an entire day in thought, contemplating what she could make with the ingredients that had been on sale in the port market, hoping to earn that particular smile. So, what else did you bring? He asked. Charlie the groundskeeper, she said, you have just received a very free pie, and now you presume to ask for more. Presume? He said around a mouthful of pie. He poked her basket with his free hand. I know there's more. Out with it. She grinned. To most she wouldn't dare impose, but Charlie was different. She revealed the tin cup. Ah, Charlie said, then put aside the pie and took the cup reverently in both hands. Now this is special. Do you know anything about that writing? She asked, eager. It's old Iriali, he said. They vanished, you know. The entire people, poof. There one day, gone the next, their island left uninhabited. Now, that was 300 years ago, so no one alive has ever met one of them, but they supposedly had golden hair. Like yours, the color of sunlight. My hair is not the color of sunlight, Charlie. Your hair is the color of sunlight, if sunlight were light brown. Charlie said. It might be said he had a way with words, in that his words often got away. I'd wager this cup has quite the history, he said. Forged for an Iriali nobleman the day before he and his people were taken by the gods. The cup was left on the table, to be collected by the poor fisherwoman who first arrived on the island and discovered the horror of an entire people gone. She passed the cup down to her grandson, who became a pirate. He eventually buried his ill-gotten treasure deep beneath the spores, only to be recovered now, after eons in darkness, to find its way to your hands. He held the cup up to catch the light. Tress smiled as he spoke. While washing the mansion's windows, she'd occasionally hear Charlie's parents berate him for talking so much. They thought it silly and unbecoming of his station. They rarely let him finish. She found that a shame. For while yes, he did ramble sometimes, she'd come to understand it was because Charlie liked stories the way Tress liked cups. Thank you, Charlie, she whispered. For what? For giving me what I want. He knew what she meant. It wasn't cups or stories. Always, he said, placing his hand on hers. Always what you want, Tress. And you can always tell me what it is. I know you don't usually do that with others. What do you want, Charlie? She asked. I don't know, he admitted. Other than one thing, that is. One thing I shouldn't want, but I do. Instead, I'm supposed to want adventure. Like in the stories. You know those stories. The ones with fair maidens, Tress said, who always get captured and don't get to do much besides sit there. Maybe call for help now and then. I suppose that does happen, he said. Why are they always fair maidens? She said. Are there maidens that are unfair? Perhaps they mean fair, as in food. I could be that kind of maiden. I'm good with food. She grimaced. I'm glad I'm not in a story, Charlie. I'd end up captured for certain. And I would probably die quickly, he said. I'm a coward, Tress. It's the truth. Nonsense. You're merely an ordinary person. Have you seen how I respond around the Duke? She grew silent. Because she had. If I weren't a coward, he said, I'd be able to tell you things I cannot. But Tress, if you did get captured, I'd help anyway. I'd put on armor, Tress. Shining armor. Or maybe dull armor. I think if someone I knew were captured, I wouldn't take the time to shine the armor. Do you think those heroes pause to shine it when people are in danger? That doesn't sound very helpful. Charlie, Tress said, do you have armor? I'd find some, he promised. I would figure something out, surely. Even a coward would be brave in the proper armor, right? There are lots of dead people in those types of stories. Surely I could get some from one of. A shout sounded from within the mansion, interrupting the conversation. It was Charlie's father grousing. So far as Tress had been able to tell, yelling at things was the Duke's one and only job on the island, and he took it very seriously. Charlie glanced toward the sounds and grew tense, his smile fading. But when the shouts didn't draw near, he looked back at the cup. The moment was gone, but another took its place, as they tend to do. Not as intimate, but still valuable because it was time with him. I'm sorry, he said softly, for bringing up silly things like fair maidens and robbing armor from dead people. But I like that you listened to me anyway. Thank you, Tress. I am fond of your stories, she said, taking the cup and turning it over. Do you think any of what you said about this cup is true? It could be, Charlie said. That's the great thing about stories. But look at this writing, it says it did once belong to a king. His name is right here. And you learned that language in gardening school, he said, in case we had to read the warnings on the packaging of certain dangerous plants. Like how you wear a lord's doublet and hose because it makes me an excellent decoy, should assassins arrive and try to kill the Duke's son. As you've said. But why then do you take off your ring? He glanced at his hand, then met her eyes. Well, I guess I'd rather you not mistake me for someone else. Someone I don't want to have to be. He smiled then, his timid smile. His please go with me on this, Tress smile. Because the son of a duke could not openly fraternize with the girl who washed the windows. A nobleman pretending to be a commoner though, feigning low station to learn of the people of his realm. Why, that was expected. It happened in so many stories, it was practically an institution. That, she said, makes perfect sense. Now then, he said, retrieving his pie. Tell me about your day. I must hear. I went browsing through the market for ingredients, she said, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. I purchased a pound of fish salmon, imported from Eric Island, where they have many lakes. Poloni marked it down because he thought it was going bad. But that was actually the fish in the next barrel. So I got my fish for a steal. Fascinating, he said. No one throws a fit when you visit. They don't call their children out and make you shake their hands. Tell me more, please. I want to know how you realized the fish wasn't bad. With his prodding, she continued elucidating the mundane details of her life. He forced her to do it each time she visited. He, in turn, paid attention. That was the proof that his fondness for talking wasn't a failing. He was equally good at listening, at least to her. Indeed, Charlie found her life interesting for some unfathomable reason. As she talked, Tress felt warm. She often did when she visited, because she climbed up high and was closer to the sun, so it was warmer up here. Obviously, except it was moonshadow at the moment, when the sun hid behind the moon and everything became a few degrees cooler. And today she was growing tired of certain lies she told herself. Perhaps there was another reason she felt warm. It was there in Charlie's current smile, and she knew it would be in her own as well. He didn't listen to her only because he was fascinated by the lives of peasants. She didn't visit only because she wanted to hear his stories. In fact, on the deepest level it wasn't about cups or stories at all. It was, instead, about gloves. Part 3. The Duke. Tress had noticed that a nice pair of gloves made her daily work go so much better. Now, she meant the good kind of gloves, made of a soft leather that molds to your hands as you use them. The kind that if you oil them well and don't leave them out in the sun don't ever grow stiff. The kind that are so comfortable, you go to wash your hands and are surprised to find you're still wearing them. The perfect set of gloves is invaluable, and Charlie was like a good set of gloves. The longer she spent with him, the more right their time together felt. The brighter even the moonshadows were, and the easier her burdens became. She did love interesting cups, but a part of that was because each one gave her an excuse to come and visit him. The thing growing between them felt so good, so wonderful, that Tress was frightened to call it love. From the way the other youths talked, love was dangerous. Their love seemed to be about jealousy and insecurity. It was about passionate shouting matches and more passionate reconciliations. It was less like a good pair of gloves, and more like a hot coal that would burn your hands. Love had always frightened Tress, but when Charlie put his hand on hers again, she felt heat. The fire she'd always feared. The coal was in there after all, just contained like in a good stove. She wanted to leap into his heat, all logic discarded. Charlie froze. They'd touched many times before, of course, but this was different. This moment, this dream. He blushed, but let his hand linger. Then he finally raised it and ran his fingers through his hair, grinning sheepishly. Because he was Charlie, that didn't spoil the moment, but instead only made it more sweet. Tress searched for the perfect thing to say. There were any number of lines that would have capitalized on that moment. She could have said, "Charlie, could you hold this for me while I walk around the grounds?" Then offered her hand back to him. She could have said, "Help, I can't breathe. Staring at you has taken my breath away." She could even have said something completely insane, such as "I like you." Instead she said, "Who? Hands are warm." She followed it with a laugh that she choked on halfway through, exactly mimicking by pure chance the call of an elephant seal. It might be said that Tress had a way with words, and that her words tended to get in her way. In response, Charlie gave her a smile, a wonderful smile, more and more confident the longer it lasted. It was one she'd never seen before. It said, "I think I love you, Tress, elephant seal notwithstanding." She smiled back at him. Then, over his shoulder, she saw the Duke standing in the window, tall and straight. The man wore military-style clothing that looked like it had been pinned to him by the various medals on the breast. He was not smiling. Indeed, she'd seen him smile only once, during the punishment of old Latari, who had tried to sneak off the island by stowing away on a merchant ship. That seemed the Duke's sole smile. Perhaps Charlie had used the entire family's quota. Nevertheless, if the Duke did have just one smile, he made up for it by displaying far too many teeth. The Duke faded into the shadows of the house, but his presence loomed over Tress as she bade farewell to Charlie. On her way down the steps, she expected to hear shouting. Instead, an ominous silence followed her. The tense silence that came after a lightning flash. It chased her down the path and around to her home, where she murmured something to her parents about being tired. She went to her room and waited for the silence to end, for the soldiers to knock, then demand to know why the girl who washed the windows had dared to touch the Duke's son. When nothing like that came, she dared hope that she was reading too much into the Duke's expression. Then she remembered the Duke's singular smile. After that, worries nipped at her all night. She rose early in the morning, wrestled her hair into a tail, then trudged to the market. Here she'd sort through the day-old goods and near-spoiled ingredients for something she could afford. Despite the early hour, the market was abuzz with activity. Men swept dead spores off the path while people gathered in chattering knots. Tress braced herself for the news, then decided nothing could be worse than the awful anticipation she'd suffered all night. She was wrong. The Duke had sent out a declaration. He and his family were going to leave the island that very day. Part 4. The Sun. Leave the island. People didn't leave the island. Tress knew, logically, that wasn't explicitly true. Royal officials could leave. The Duke left on occasion to report to the king. Plus he'd earned all those fancy medals by killing people from a distant place where they looked slightly different. He'd apparently been quite heroic during those wars, you could tell because a great number of his troops had died while he lived. But in the past, the Duke had never taken his family. The ducal heir has come of age, the proclamation announced, and so we shall present him for betrothal to the various princesses of the civilized seas. Now, Tress was a pragmatic young woman, and so she only thought about ripping her shopping basket to shreds in frustration. She merely deliberated whether it would be appropriate to swear at the top of her lungs. She barely considered marching up to the Duke's mansion to demand he change his mind. Instead, she went about her shopping in a numb haze, using the familiar action to give her suddenly crumbling life a semblance of normality. She found some garlic she was certain she could salvage, several potatoes that hadn't withered too badly, and even some grain where the weevils were large enough to pick out. Yesterday, she'd have been pleased with this haul. Today, she couldn't think of anything but Charlie. It seemed so incredibly unfair. She had only just acknowledged what she felt for him, and already everything was turning upside down. Yes, she'd been told to expect this pain. Love involves pain. But that was the salt in your tea. Wasn't there also supposed to be a dab of honey? Wasn't there supposed to be dared she wish passion? She was to receive all of the detriments of a romantic affair with none of the advantages. Unfortunately, her practicality began to assert itself. So long as the two of them had been able to pretend, the real world hadn't been able to claim them. But the days of pretending were over. What did she thought was going to happen? That the Duke would let her marry his son. What did she think she could offer someone like Charlie? She was nothing compared to a princess. Think of how many cups they could afford. In the pretend world, marriage was about love. In the real world, it was about politics. A word laden with a large number of meanings, though most of them boiled down to, this is a matter for nobles and the very rich to discuss, not peasants. She finished her shopping and started up the path toward her home, where at least she could commiserate with her parents. But it appeared that the Duke was wasting no time, for she saw a procession snaking down toward the docks. She turned around and walked back via a different path, arriving right after the procession, which began to load the family's things onto a merchant ship. Nobody was allowed to leave the island, unless they were, instead, somebody. Tress worried she wouldn't get a chance to speak with Charlie. Then she worried that she would, but he wouldn't want to see her. Mercifully, she caught him standing at the side of the crowd, searching among the gathering people. The moment he spotted her, he rushed over. Tress. Oh, moons. I worried I wouldn't find you in time. Aye. What did she say? Fair maiden, he said, bowing. I must take my leave. Charlie, she said softly, don't try to be someone you aren't. I know you. He grimaced. He was wearing a traveling coat and even a hat. The Duke considered hats improper wear except during travel. Tress, he said, softer. I'm afraid I've lied to you. You see, I'm not the groundskeeper. I'm ... the Duke's son. Amazing. Who would have thought that Charlie the groundskeeper and Charles the Duke's heir would be the same person? Considering they're the same age, look the same, and wear the same clothing. Yes. Are you angry at me? Anger is in line right now, Tress said. It's seventh down, sandwiched between confusion and fatigue. Behind them, Charlie's father and mother marched up onto the ship. Their servants followed with the last of the luggage. Charlie gazed at his feet. It seems I am to be married. To a princess of some nation or another. What do you think of that? Aye. What should she say? I wish you well. He looked up and met her eyes. Always, Tress. Remember, it was hard for her. But after groping around for a moment, she found the words hiding in a corner, trying to avoid her. I wish, she said, seizing hold of them, that you wouldn't do that. Get married. To someone else. Oh, he blinked. Do you really? I mean, I'm sure they are very nice. The princesses. I believe it's part of the job description, Charlie said. Like, have you heard of the things they do in stories? Resuscitate amphibians. Notice for parents that their children have wet the bed. One would have to be relatively kind to do these services. Yes, Tress said. Aye. She took a deep breath. I would still rather you didn't marry one of them. Well then, I shan't, Charlie said. I don't believe you have a choice, Charlie. Your father wants you married. It's politics. Ah, but you see, I have a secret weapon. He took her hands and leaned in. Behind, his father moved up to the prow of the ship and looked down, scowling. Charlie, however, smiled a lopsided smile. His look how sneaky I am smile. He used it when he wasn't being particularly sneaky. What ... kind of secret weapon, Charlie? She asked. I can be incredibly boring. That's not a weapon. It might not be one in a war, Tress, he said. But in courtship, it is as fine a weapon as the sharpest rapier. You know how I go on, and on, and on. I like how you go on, Charlie. I don't mind the on, in fact. I sometimes quite enjoy the on. You are a special case, Charlie said. You are ... well, this is kind of silly ... but you're like a pair of gloves, Tress. I am, she said, choking up. Yes, don't be offended. I mean, when I have to practice the sword, I wear these gloves and I understand, she whispered. From atop the ship, Charlie's father shouted for him to be quick. Tress realized then that like Charlie had different kinds of smiles, his father had different kinds of scowls. She didn't much like what the current one implied about her. Charlie squeezed her hands. Listen, Tress, I promise you, I'm not going to get married. I'm going to go to those kingdoms, and I'm going to be so insufferably boring that none of the girls will have me. I'm not good at much. I've never scored a single point against my father in sparring. I spill my soup at formal dinners. I talk so much. Even my footman who is paid to listen comes up with creative reasons to interrupt me. The other day I was telling him the story of the fish and the gull, and he pretended to stub his toe, and the Duke shouted again. I can do this, Tress, Charlie insisted. I will do this. At each stop, I'll pick out a cup for you, all right. Once I've bored the current princess to death and my father has decided we need to move on, I'll send you the cup. As proof, you see. He squeezed her hands once more. I'll do it, not only because you listen, but because you know me, Tress. You've always been able to see me when others don't. He began turning to finally respond to his father's shouts. Tress held on, clinging to his hands, unwilling to let it end. Charlie gave her one last smile, and though he was plainly trying to act confident, she knew his smiles. This was his uncertain one, hopeful but worried. You are my gloves too, Charlie, Tress said to him. After that, she had to let go so he could jog up the plank. She'd imposed enough already. The Duke forced his son below decks as the ship slipped off the dead gray spars nearest the rock and into the true verdant ocean. Wind caught the ship's sails and it struck out toward the horizon, leaving a wake of disturbed emerald dust behind it. Tress climbed up to her house, then watched from the cliff until the ship was the size of a cup, then the size of a speck. Then it vanished. After that, the waiting began. They say that to wait is the most excruciating of life's torments. They in this case refers to writers, who have nothing useful to do, so fill their time thinking of things to say. Any working person can tell you that having time to wait is a luxury. Tress had windows to wash, meals to cook, a little brother to watch. Her father, Lem, had never recovered from his accident in the mines, and though he tried to assist, he could barely walk. He helped Tress's mother, Ulba, knit socks all day, which they sold to sailors. But with the expensive yarn they turned only a meager profit. So Tress didn't wait. She worked. Still, it was an enormous relief when the first cup arrived. It was delivered by Hoyd the cabin boy. Yes, that's me. What tipped you off? Was it perhaps the name? A beautiful porcelain cup, without even a single chip in it. The world brightened that day. Tress could almost imagine Charlie speaking as she read the accompanying letter, which detailed the affections of the first princess. With heroic monotony, he had listed the sounds his stomach made when he lay in various positions at night. As that hadn't been quite enough, he'd then explained how he kept his toenail clippings and gave them names. That had done it. Fight on, my loquacious love, Tress thought as she scrubbed the mansion's windows the next day. Be brave, my mildly gross warrior. The second cup was of pure red glass, tall and thin, and looked like it could contain more liquid than it actually did. Perhaps it came from a particularly stingy tavern. He'd put off this princess by explaining what he'd had for breakfast in intricate detail, as he'd counted the pieces of the scrambled egg and categorized them by size. The third cup was an enormous solid pewter tankard with heft to it. Perhaps it was from one of those places Charlie had made up, where people always needed to carry weapons. Tress was reasonably certain she could knock out an attacker by swinging the tankard. The latest princess hadn't been able to withstand an extended conversation about the benefits of various punctuation marks, including a few Charlie had invented. The fourth package card included no letter, only a small drawing, two gloved hands holding to one another. The cup had a painted butterfly on it with a red ocean underneath. She found it odd that the butterfly wasn't terrified of the spores. Maybe it was a prisoner, forced to fly out over the ocean to its doom. The fifth cup never arrived. Tress tried to play it off, telling herself that it must have been interrupted in transit. After all, any number of dangerous things could happen to a ship sailing the spores. Pirates or ... you know, spores. But the months stretched long, each more tedious than the one before. Every time a ship arrived at the docks, Tress was there asking for mail. Nothing. She did this for months on end, until an entire year had passed since Charlie had left. Then, finally, a note. Not from Charlie, but from his father, sent to the entire town. The Duke was returning to Diggins Point at long last, and he was bringing his wife, his heir, and his new daughter-in-law. Part 5. The Bride. Tress sat upon her porch, leaning against her mother, and watched the horizon. She held the last cup Charlie had sent. The one with the suicidal butterfly. Her lukewarm tea tasted of tears. It wasn't very practical, she whispered to her mother. Love rarely is, her mother replied. She was a stout woman, with a cheerful kind of girth. 5 years ago, she'd been thin as a reed. Then Tress had learned her mother was giving up a portion of her food to her children from then on. Tress had taken over shopping and had made their money stretch further. A ship appeared on the horizon. I've finally thought of what I should have said. Tress pushed her hair out of her eyes. When he left, I called him a glove. It isn't so bad as it sounds. He just called me one, you see. I've had a year to think about it, and I realized I could have said something more. Her mother squeezed her shoulder as the ship drew inevitably closer. I should have said, Tress whispered, that I loved him. Her mother joined her as she marched, like a soldier on the front lines facing cannon fire, down to the docks to greet the ship. Her father, with his bad leg, stayed behind, which was good. She feared he'd make a scene, the way he'd been grumbling about the Duke and his son these last few months. But Tress could not find it in herself to blame Charlie. It wasn't his fault that he was the Duke's son. It could have happened to anyone, really. A crowd had gathered. The Duke's letter said he wanted a celebration and he was bringing food and wine. Whatever else the people thought of getting a new future duchess, they were not going to miss a chance at free alcohol. Tress and her mother arrived at the back of the crowd, but Holmes the baker waved them up on his steps so they could see better. He was a kind man, always saving the ends of loaves, then selling them to her for pennies. So it was that Tress had a good view of the princess as she appeared on the deck. She was beautiful, rosy cheeks, shimmering hair, delicate features. She was so perfect, the finest painter in the seas couldn't have made improvements in her portrait. Charlie had at last been able to become part of a story. With effort, Tress was happy for him. The Duke appeared next, waving his hand so the people knew to cheer for him. "I present," he shouted, "my heir." A young man stepped up onto the deck beside the princess, and it was most definitely not Charlie. This young man was around the same age as Charlie, but he was 6.5 feet tall and had a jaw so straight it made other men question if they were. He bulged with muscles to the point that when he lifted his arm to wave, Tress swore she could hear the seams on his shirt begging for mercy. What under the 12 moons? After an unfortunate accident, the Duke proclaimed to the hushed crowd, "I was forced to adopt my nephew Dirk and appoint him as my new heir." He gave a moment for the crowd to take that in. "He's an excellent fencer," the Duke continued, and responds to questions with single-sentence answers, sometimes using only one word. Also, he's a war hero. He lost 10,000 men in the Battle of Lake Privy. 10,000. Tress's mother said, "My, that's a lot. We shall now celebrate Dirk's marriage to the Princess of Dormancy," the Duke shouted, raising his hands high. The crowd remained quiet, still confused. "I brought 30 kegs," the Duke shouted. They cheered. And so, a party it was. The townspeople led the way up to the feast hall. They remarked on the princess's beauty and marveled that Dirk managed to balance so well while walking, considering his center of gravity must have been located somewhere around his upper sternum. Tress's mother told her she would get answers, and followed the crowd. However, when Tress came out of her shock, she found Flick, one of the Duke's servants, waving to her from near the bottom of the gangplank. He was a kindly man, with wide ears that looked as if they were waiting for the right moment to bolt and fly away. "Flick," she whispered. "What happened?" "An accident." "Where is Charlie?" Flick glanced up at the train of people walking to the feast hall. The Duke and his family had joined them, and were far enough away that any scowls would lose their potency due to wind resistance and gravitational drop. "You wanted me to give you this," Flick said, handing her a small sack. It tinkled as she took it. Inside were broken pieces of ceramic. "The 5th cup. He tried so hard, Miss Tress," Flick whispered. "Oh, you should have seen the young master. He did everything he could to put those women off. He memorized 87 different types of plywood and their uses. He told every princess he met at length about his childhood pets. He even talked about religion. I thought they had him at the 5th kingdom, as that princess was deaf, but the young master went and threw up on her at dinner. He threw up, straight in her lap, Miss Tress." Flick looked both ways, then waved for her to follow as he carried some luggage off the docks, leading them to a more secluded location. But his father got wise. Miss Tress figured out what the young master was doing. The Duke got right mad. Right mad indeed. He gestured to the broken cup she was carrying in her sack. "Yes, but what happened to Charlie?" Tress asked. Flick looked away. "Please," Tress asked. "Where is he?" "He sailed the midnight sea, Miss Tress," he said. "Beneath Thanasmia's own moon. The sorceress took him." Those names sent a chill through Tress. The midnight sea. The domain of the sorceress. Why would he ever do such a thing? "Well, I think it's because his father forced him to," Flick said. "The sorceress isn't married, and the king has long wanted to try to make her less of a threat. So, the king sent Charlie to try to marry the sorceress." Flick didn't respond. "No," Tress said, realizing it. "He sent Charlie to die." "I didn't say anything like that," Flick said, hurrying off. "If anyone asks, I didn't say anything like that." Tress sat down on one of the dock pillars. She listened to the spores stirring, a sound like pouring sand. Even on an out-of-the-way island like hers, they knew of the sorceress. She periodically sent ships in to raid the borders of the Verdant Sea, and it was incredibly difficult to fight her. Her stronghold lay hidden somewhere in the remote Midnight Sea, most dangerous of them all. And to get to it you had to cross the Crimson Sea, an unpopulated sea that was only slightly less deadly. Finding out Charlie had been captured by her was like finding out he'd gone up to one of the moons. Tress couldn't just take one man's word. Not on something like this. She didn't dare bother others with questions, but she listened as the servants talked in hushed tones to inquisitive dock workers, eager to get the ship unloaded so they could join the party. They all gave similar answers. Yes, Charlie had been sent to the Midnight Sea. The Duke and the King had decided it together, so it must have been a good idea. After all, someone had to try to stop the sorceress from raiding. And Charlie, of all people, was the obvious choice for reasons. The implications horrified Tress. The Duke and the King had realized Charlie was being difficult, and their solution had been to simply get rid of him. Dirk had been instated as heir within hours of receiving word that Charlie's ship had vanished. In the eyes of the nobles, this was an elegant result. The Duke got an heir he could finally be proud of. The King got an advantageous marriage alliance in Dirk's bride from another kingdom. And everyone got to blame another death on the sorceress, building public opinion toward another war. After 3 days, Tress at last dared impose on Brunswick the Duke's steward with a plea for more information. As he liked her pies, he admitted that they'd received a ransom letter from the sorceress. But the Duke, in his wisdom, had judged it to be a trick to lure more ships into the Midnight Sea. The king had declared Charlie officially dead. Days passed. Tress lived them in a daze, realizing nobody cared. They called it politics and moved on. Though the new heir had the intellect of a soggy piece of bread, he was popular, handsome, and very good at getting other people killed. While Charlie had been Tress spent weeks gathering her courage, then went to ask the Duke if he'd please pay the ransom. Such a bold move was difficult for her. She wasn't a coward, but imposing upon people it simply wasn't something she did. But with her parents' encouragement, she made the long trek and quietly made her request. The Duke, in turn, called her a hazelnut-haired strumpet and forbade her from washing windows anywhere in town. She was forced to begin knitting socks with her parents for greatly reduced pay. As the weeks passed, Tress fell into a lethargy. She felt less like a mere human being, and more like a human who was merely being. Life on the rock for everyone else returned to normal, easy as that. Nobody cared. Nobody was going to do anything. Until it was 2 months after the Duke's return that Tress made her decision. There was somebody who cared. Naturally, it would be up to that person to do something. Tress couldn't impose on anyone else. She was going to have to go rescue Charlie herself.